What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, bad boys. What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
Hello everyone, and welcome to our second YouTube lecture. We're now in period 2, 1607 to 1754, and I'm going to try to focus as best as possible on the English Civil War. But I also want to throw in one of our key concepts here. I'm going to look at 2.2, and we're going to look at letter C here. What I want to focus on is this word here, mercantilist, mercantilism. This is a type of an economic system that it's developed at this time period by Europeans as they're creating colonies. And the English will utilize mercantilism to the best of their ability. It's, like I said, it's an economic system. It's a type of bridge between the old feudal system and eventually what will emerge that we call today capitalism. Now, you see here that they use this to try to incorporate all of North American colonies into one type of imperial structure, and they use their mercantile system in order to do that. But what exactly is mercantilism? Whoa, where am I? Oh, here I am. Well, mercantilism. Well, again, it's developed by a bunch of economic philosophers, I guess you could say. It talks about how important the wealth of a nation would be. But that wealth could only be maintained through vigorous trade. But the problem is, much of Europe can't stand each other. It's not as though England and France are going to just be free trade partners. They really aren't ready to do that. So as Europe is going out to what we call the New World and establishing colonies, colonies become the linchpin, the key factor, if you will, in order for mercantilism to work. They're essential for all trade growth. Colonies are there for the sole purpose of benefiting the mother country. So we'll talk about it from England's point of view. Now in class we've already talked about tobacco. Now think of it this way. You're in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. You have a tobacco plantation. You have paid to bring indentured servants over, or maybe later in the 1600s you're actually purchasing slaves for yourself. So that's a cost to you. And you purchase all what you need to plant and harvest your tobacco. So once you've harvested the tobacco, you'll dry the leaves, and then you'll bundle the leaves, and you've got 1 million pounds of tobacco. You are now going to take it to market at one of the ports, and there are already English merchants there that represent various companies in England and other parts of the English colonial empire, and you're going to sell it to one of these companies for the best price you could possibly get. They will then take it back to England, and it's there in England they'll take your product and transform it into cigarettes, cigars, for pipes, the tobacco used to put into pipes, and various other things I guess you would use tobacco for. In turn, those cigarette companies would come back to the colonies and set up stores here locally where you would then buy the made product, the cigarette, the cigar, the tobacco you put in your pipe. You weren't allowed to make your own cigarettes. The same thing with any essential resource that you could have. Let's say you were in the lumber business. You were allowed to go out and cut down trees. You're allowed to perhaps take those trees and turn them into lumber, but then you had to sell that lumber back to England. England in turn would make tables and chairs, tools with their handles for the tools and various things of that, and then sell it back to the colonies in their stores. And that's how mercantilism worked. The mother country actually made the better profit here. As a colonist, you did get paid for selling whatever you had. Tobacco, lumber, beaver pelts, we talked about that. You did get paid, but then as the English companies would try to sell the finished product back to you, they would sell it at pretty high prices. And this is what started to lead a lot of colonists over a 50-year, 100-year, 150-year period of time to begin to question, why are we doing all the work and England's making most of the profit here? So some of the colonists would try to trade with other countries to get a little better price than what they were getting from England. England would then try to enforce their mercantilist policy through a series of laws called Navigation Acts. And I'll talk about 3 of them here as we go through the slide. But oftentimes they would ignore their own law. It was called salutary neglect or beneficial neglect, because they would realize after a while it's probably best to allow the colonists to smuggle, illegally trade, because if the colonists illegally trade with, say, France or Spain and got a higher price, well, there's more gold coin now in the colonies, and they can in turn use some of those gold coins to buy British-made products. So salutary neglect was a type of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I won't stop you from smuggling so long as you buy British-made products. But from time to time, England would, for whatever reason, try to stop colonists from doing this, only to get lax in their own laws. And I'll talk about that as I go through this PowerPoint. So let's see here. Next one. Oops. There we go. So the English Civil War. This Civil War takes place in England, hence the English Civil War. It began in 1642, but it was starting much earlier than that. King Charles I, he takes over after James I dies, and he's not such a bad king per se, and we'll talk about him in class as well. His wife is a Catholic, Henrietta Maria, and it's from her that we get the colony Terra Maria, the land of Mary, or Maryland. And he seems to have some pretty sneaky Catholic leanings. He gets involved in some of the Catholic religious wars in Europe. This starts to anger individuals. He doesn't get along well with Parliament. He wants to be an absolute monarch, and Parliament wants to share power. Sometimes they also call this Civil War the Puritan Revolution. Puritans are starting to dominate the House of Commons, and they begin to call for reform in the government, and Charles won't do this. And eventually a war will break out in 1642, a civil war. Oliver Cromwell is the Puritan leader of the armies. One of the interesting things that will come out of this war, Cromwell invents the modern English army. Whenever you think of England in the colonial time, think for a second. I'll let you just think for a little bit in your mind. What do you think how that army looked? How do you think it dressed? Huh? What? No, they're not Germans. They're English. So, did you think they looked red? The Red Armies? All red coats? This is where it begins. The modern English army. It's the Puritan army that creates this. A standing army, a professional army is going to emerge out of this war, and the Puritans are the ones who are going to develop it. How does this affect the colonies? Well, we'll start with Virginia. Virginia is a loyal colony. We talked about this in class. They want to be like England. They want to represent or recreate for themselves the English manor countryside, where you have feudalism takes place, you have lords, and you have peasants that work the fields for you, and that's what Virginia likes. Remember, they believe in liberty. They do not believe in freedom. So they believe that rights are a privilege, and thereby they're going to support the king. Governor William Berkeley is a huge supporter of Charles I. Virginia becomes a refugee colony for those individuals who will leave. Cavaliers, the supporters of Charles I. This here is a painting of what a cavalier looks like. It was a derogatory term that the Puritans first came up with, calling anyone who supported the king a cavalier. They mocked their way. They dressed in a very flamboyant, fluffy, puffy type of style. But eventually, many of these cavaliers themselves were part of the king's cavalry. So over time, cavalier has also been associated with man on horseback or man who defends the king. Well, many of them will become refugees and wind up in Virginia. There will be some Virginians who will raise small militia bands and will actually go to England to fight on the side of the king. But unfortunately, in 1649, the king loses, and he loses big time. And I mean big time. In order to win a war and overthrow a monarchy, you have to commit what's called regicides. That means you cut off the head of the king. That's not nice. Anyways, King Charles I will lose his head at the end of the English Civil War. Oliver Cromwell will set up a Commonwealth Republic under his leadership. And starting in 1650, a whole new government emerges in England. No more monarchy, no more king. But ironically, it's at this time that the government passes its first navigation acts. 1650, and then they kind of revised it a little bit in 1651. They had, war is expensive, as I talked about in class the other day. It costs a lot of money to persecute this war, the Civil War, and they can't allow the American colonists to continue to smuggle. They've got to make sure that they keep mercantilism intact, so they passed their first Navigation Act. Stop all trade with the Dutch. Virginians are pretty much okay with this. It's going to be Massachusetts who will have the biggest problem, as we'll talk about here in a moment. In fact, let's go right to it and see why. Massachusetts is going to benefit from this war because they are founded by Puritans. Puritans who fought the English War. Puritans had come to dominate Parliament. Puritans are the founders of the colony of Massachusetts. They've always been hostile towards royals and the aristocrats in Virginia. So they will side, obviously, with Cromwell's men. There will be some Puritans that will leave Massachusetts and go fight against the king. They also took great advantage of the war in 1643. Now, we'll talk about, we haven't really got to the Puritans yet, so this is kind of a little bit of a precursor, if you will, kind of a spoiler alert to what we're going to talk about on Monday in class. Massachusetts is founded in 1630. And, of course, the war breaks out in 1642, so 12 years later. The Puritans took advantage of this. There are 4 colonies that they will band together and try to form their own nation. They'll call it the New England Confederation. Now, this is totally against English law for them to have done this. They took advantage of the war. They claimed that they needed it for self-defense purposes against the Indians and any other hostile Europeans that may be out there. But it was really a way for them to try to create their perfect utopia with a religion and a strict moral compass as what they believed in. That would be government. Also very democratic, and we'll talk about that, how the Puritans bring a lot of democracy to America. And again, they openly would support this new government. And as long as Cromwell was in charge throughout the 1650s, the Puritans were doing fine in America. However, because they are kind of a very close, tight people, they don't like anything that's different from them, it will force that they will suffer from this. Very few immigrants are going to go to the New England area. The majority of your immigrants are going to go to the New York area, Pennsylvania, and even into the southern colonies. No one wants to go where there's a very strict Puritan form of government where everybody has to be the same religion and everyone has to basically think the same. So that in the long run is going to hurt New England. Over the next 100 years, they will not grow in population like the other colonies will. That first Navigation Act, I told you, would hurt the Puritans more because the Puritans, what's starting to happen in Massachusetts by the 1650s is they're starting to establish a lot of merchant ships and a lot of trade is coming out of Boston. And people in Boston like smuggling. So this would hurt them in a way. And even though they supported the government, they weren't very happy with the Navigation Act. Although, as I told you, after a while, they don't even really, the English won't even really enforce the Navigation Acts. Well, all will be fine until 1660. Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658. I'm sorry, spoiler alert, I probably should let you read the book on that one. Anyways, and Charles I's son, Charles II, see how original the English are? He will now come to the crown. England is tired of a commonwealth. England actually desired the monarchy to come back. And like I said, Cromwell dies in 1658. His son tried to keep the government going, but it wasn't going to work. And in 1660, they crowned Charles II King of England. This is known as the Restoration period. Literally, they're restoring the monarchy. So over the next few decades, Charles is going to do everything he can to get rid of all the Puritan laws that took effect throughout the 1650s and bring back a strong monarchy. He's also going to turn his eye towards the Puritans of America, and he's going to crush their independent-minded spirit. He's going to outlaw the New England Confederacy. That is going to break up. Also, it's kind of funny that he will eventually get rid of every Puritan law that Parliament passed during Oliver Cromwell, but he liked the Navigation Act. So he comes up with his own Navigation Act, number 2, in the 1660s. This one not only stops you from trading with other countries, but it created something called enumerated commodities. Number. In other words, it's too easy to smuggle. You could go down to the sugar plantations, for instance, in the Caribbean, and claim that you took on 500 pounds of sugar. But by the time you got to Boston, maybe there'd only be 200 pounds of sugar, because you've smuggled that sugar at other places with the French or the Spanish or the Dutch. Well, now you have to have all these commodities numbered or enumerated. You gotta go down to Jamaica or any of the other sugar plantations, Haiti, and you have to get an official document that will number all of your commodities on your ship. And it's an official document so that by the time you get to Boston, you'll have this official document that will claim you have what you're supposed to have. But think about it. Remember, they live in a paper world. It was very easy for a lot of the ship captains to take the original document and burn it and then forge one that looked like an official document so they could still smuggle. So they still found ways to get around the Navigation Acts. Well, I won't get into a lot about Charles. He eventually does die. Spoiler alert, I know. I keep telling you all these people are dying. I should let you just read the book. Well, his brother is James II. Oh my goodness, these English kings' names, I can't. So in 1685, but James is an older man when he takes over. He's the last of Roman Catholic kings in England's history. He had secretively practiced Catholicism, but when he became a king, he decided to basically come out into the open. This is going to cause a lot of problems, but at first Parliament was like, you know what? His father, Charles I, was friendly with the Catholic Church, and that started a civil war, the English Civil War. We don't want another civil war, all right? So we'll just let everything go, and because he's old and he'll eventually die, and we'll get somebody else. But the problem is he'll eventually have a baby. He'll marry a young Spanish woman, or a younger Spanish woman, and they'll give birth to a little baby boy. Yeah. Oh, it's so cute. But, that's not going to be a good thing, though, for Parliament. They're going to realize now a Catholic dynasty is being made. In the meantime, James II will continue to crush the Puritans of New England. He will force all of New England colonies and parts of New York into what he calls the Dominion of New England. He'll cancel their charter. Their official charter of Massachusetts will be taken away. He'll pass laws that no longer allow Puritans to hold office. And he'll put Sir Edmund Andros in charge of all of this, a non-Puritan, somebody that the Puritans will absolutely despise. But fortunately for the Puritans of America, this won't last too long, because Parliament, they don't want to deal with a baby Catholic boy. and bring about a Catholic monarchy. So they will start another revolution, the glorious revolution. It's glorious because nobody gets shot, nobody dies. They tricked James. They tell James that the Dutch are invading and we've got to get out of England. And they wind up getting him to abdicate his throne and heading off to Spain. Well, it was a ruse. Instead, James, this is going to be very confusing. James has a daughter named Mary. Mary is married to the Duke of Orange, William III. Legally, they have a claim to the throne of England. Parliament has convinced William to come to England, and they will crown him King of England once they trick James II out of it. And that's what happens. James thinks they're going to war. They're not going to war. James advocates the throne, and Parliament crowns William King of England, Mary Queen of England. The glorious revolution. By the way, William couldn't speak any English, so that was really a cool thing to have that. That is your king. You can't speak the same language. But Mary, obviously, could speak English. William also gives us our third navigation axe. He liked the navigation axe as well. He tries to stop smuggling altogether. And this third set of navigation axe, I believe in the 1690s is when it comes about, he adds this trial by vice admiralties. If you're if you're a captain on a merchant ship, you're trading tobacco or sugar or coffee or whatever it is, tea, and you're caught, normally you would be sentenced to a trial, but you could have a trial in the colonies where you would probably win your trial. Not anymore. If you're caught smuggling, you go to what's called a vice admiralty court, which is a naval court. It's all captains of the British Navy that will try you. There are no juries in a vice admiralty court. It's usually 3 to 5 ship captains within the Royal Navy. They decide your fate. And if you're found guilty, you hang. Not a fun sentence to have. But again, they won't really enforce this law too heavily because, again, they really need the colonies to have some sort of money in order for mercantilism to work perfectly. You've got to allow the colonists to buy your products. So they only stop a little bit of the smuggling. Well, that's that. And here is some of the reading to kind of augment what I'm talking about here. It looks like a lot of reading, but it's actually not. The subheading here on page 61 is just 3 paragraphs, the Puritan Revolution, which is the English Civil War. And here there's a lot of pictures and graphs, so it's not as much as you think it might be. But it explains, again, mercantilism and the imperial policy towards the Americans. Well, I hope everybody has a fun evening or day or whatever it is, the weekend, whenever you might be listening to this, and I'll see you later.